So we're just going to get started right away. Um, so just a little bit of background with who we are. So Chris and I, we are the co-founders of Been There, Got Out. We are high conflict divorce strategists who specialize in something called legal abuse. And that's where ours and our clients' exes weaponize the legal system to wear them down and bleed them dry financially. So we deal with only the most extreme divorces, separations, custody battles, and co-parenting hell. And one of the things that we've seen more common than anything that's just baked right into legal abuse or post-separation abuse is parental alienation. And so we always say that our content is driven by our clients and our community. And we've seen more and more demand for assistance with parental alienation. Our current book is coming out in January on this topic called When Your Ex Turns the Kids Against You. And so we met Charlie a little while ago, and I was thrilled because he's a specialist in alienation. So let me pass the mic to you, Charlie. Why don't you say what you do?
Great, thanks, Lisa. Well, hi everybody, and we're absolutely delighted that so many people are joining us here today. Yeah, so my name is Charlie McCready. I'm a parental alienation coach. The thing that I really focus on is helping parents to understand what alienation is, because it's very counterintuitive. But I also help parents to reconnect with their kids, and this is a very, very subtle process and can be very counterintuitive. And we all make loads of mistakes. And the other big area that I really focus on is helping parents themselves, because we get blindsided when we're going through parental alienation, and it affects every aspect of our life. And so it's really important that parents do, again, the counterintuitive thing, which is to focus on themselves, rebuild their own resilience. And in doing so, that best places them to be able to help their kids. So there's a lot of stuff that, doesn't make sense initially, but the more you learn about it, the more you start realizing that sometimes the things you think you shouldn't do, you should do.
Yeah. So Charlie and I have done some collaborations before, and now with the book coming out and with what Charlie's doing with his community, we thought it'd be great for us to do a series of monthly webinars. And so the first one is going to be, as you guys know already, on something called pre-alienation, which is a term that I believe, Charlie, you coined. And so we're going to be talking about what pre-alienation is, how it affects your family, and if we have time, but Charlie and I are both very, very chatty, then we might start getting into how to start properly documenting for court. So, Chris, why don't you talk about a little how it's going to work technology wise?
Sure. So you guys, this is mostly going to be the early part of the session will be you and Charlie having a conversation, but I'll be watching the chat as well as letting people in and things like that. If you have any technical problems, put it in the chat, but also we want your questions. So I'll be watching the questions and I might ask clarifying something back in the chat. So if as we go along you have a question, just please go ahead and put it in the chat. And if it hasn't been addressed by the time we get to the Q&A, I'll give Lisa and Charlie a chance to respond.
All right, great. So let's get right into it. So Charlie, first of all, what is parental alienation before we go into what pre-alienation is?
Yeah, I think that's really helpful to start with. So parental alienation, because a lot of people might not have actually come across this, or they might even be going through it, but they don't realize they're going through it. But it's essentially where one parent seeks to weaponize the children against another parent. So they will create a negative narrative that basically puts the child into this kind of loyalty conflict that the child is forced to see one parent as being good, the other parent as being bad. So we call them the alienators. And the alienators adopt a lot of tricks, which we're going to talk about, to basically try to turn your kid against you. So you don't get time with the kid, they see you in a poor light. It can be really damaging to your relationship with your child.
Yeah, and like I said, we see this all the time where there's different stages of alienation, but often children who are severely alienated want nothing to do with you as their parent. Sometimes they become hysterical if you're even in their presence. And so what we want to do, part of this goal of today is to prevent that from getting there. And if it's there, then hopefully start turning it around. So, Charlie, tell us about pre-alienation.
So as you say, this is something that I kind of coined this term. I've personally been through this experience as well. And it was really with hindsight that I became aware that I'd been through a period of a decade of what I would call pre-alienation. So this is very, very subtle stuff that in essence, the person you're currently married or your partner to is starting to turn the kids against you in a very subtle way. So they might undermine your boundaries. They might undermine your relationship. They might undermine the time you get with your kid. Um, but what they're doing is that they're basically starting to align the children with them rather than with you. And it's so subtle that we just think, oh, it's we don't see the damage that's being done during this period of time. We just think it's a difficult relationship with our partner, or we think they're being a little bit obsessive with the children. But it's very, very subtle. But I think,
Yeah.
uh,
I think we should talk about some examples of that, like
mm, mm,
specific things, because I already was thinking of a couple.
yeah. So um, the boundaries is a really good one. So we might want to parent our children in a particular way, encouraging them to do, say, homework. So we'll see that as being something really important, or going to bed at a reasonable time, or not being allowed to stay up too late playing video games. But our partner has a different perspective. So they do let the kids get away with things. So they you know if we say you've got to go to bed, you can't play video games, carrying on, they'll undermine our authority and allow the child to carry on playing those games. And of course, the child will align with the person who is being the most lax with them. And very often, one of the characters of the alienators that we'll see is they're more like a buddy to the
Mhm.
child rather than a parent, or they go the other way because they can be quite polarized. They can also be incredibly controlling over the child. So again, our rules get undermined, our boundaries get undermined because they're trying to control the kid and they don't want us to have input into kind of how the child should behave.
Yeah, when you were saying something about minimizing your authority, that brought me back, major flashback to when my son was really little. And every time I would discipline him, if I said, you're not allowed to do that, you got to sit out for a while. I remember my ex would come into the room and open the door and say, "Oh, Izzy, you don't need to listen to mom. She's just
Mm.
cranky. You could take it back. You could do something else to make up for it." And I think as a parent, and especially because my background is in education and I was a high school English teacher where classroom management is a really big deal, I kept thinking, what, you're just ruining it, not for me with the undermining, but you're making our son believe that he's allowed to do whatever he wants to. And
Mm.
that impacted his life in a variety of ways just as he got older,
Yep.
because I think of that undermining.
Yeah. I mean, in my particular circumstances, the big issue was all around money.
Hmm.
And what was actually going on was my ex, she was very into horses. And so she acquired a pony for my kids when they were 3 and 5 years old, ostensibly for the children. But
Wow.
really, this was all about, her pursuing something that she wanted to do. And then a horse materialized to keep the pony company. Of course, the horse was for her. And this increased over a period of time to the point that I mean, horses were being hidden from me. We got up to 14 animals. Yeah.
Wow.
And
That's
so
a big one.
money became a really big thing in the household, to the point that I was objecting to having, so many horses, because there's only so many that a single person can ride at one point in time. And it became a thing that unless I paid for the horses, the kids were being turned against me. You're a bad dad, you're a mean dad.
You're
And
not supporting what they're passionate about.
yeah, yeah. And it actually extends even into the current time. So this was something that started when they were 3 and 5.
Hmm.
And even to this day, the kids have got issues with money, and their perception of me with money even though I was the person who was paying for everything.
Hmm.
But there will normally be something that the alienator is upset about that will be the key reason that they're starting to turn the kids against us. So it might be, and with a lot of the people who have the propensity to alienate, they're often quite they show or they're demonstrating signs of narcissism. And I know this
Hmm.
is bandied around quite a lot. But if you are with somebody who's narcissistic, you'll often find that they're using various techniques to control the children because they have to control the environment around themselves just to keep themselves safe.
Yeah, as you're talking, I'm thinking also about how they will mock you or
Mm.
ridicule you. Things about your clothes, your appearance, your friends, your hobbies, your work, just to sort of not just minimize your authority, but minimize you as a human being. We always say it's like you're not just a bad parent, but you're a bad person. Do your people that you work with see that a lot too?
Absolutely. And they will turn anything associated with you into
Hmm.
being negative. So if you like a sport or a hobby, or you like a type of music, or you like to do certain things with your friends, those all become negative things for the children. And you'll notice that this kind of pre-alienation phase that they're trying to discourage the child from spending time with you,
Hmm.
which they might do by I mean, in my case, it was just horses, horses, horses. Other people, it's different sports, or just not giving the parent the opportunity to really spend time with their kids.
Yeah.
Uh, what another great example I've with somebody I'm working with at the moment, the alienator's technique is just constantly interrupting. So you can't have a conversation with your children without this person controlling the narrative at the table. The kids can't speak, the parent can't speak, so nobody can have a conversation. But I was just going to ask, because I mean, from your perspective, because you look at this from a legal side, what do you find kind of challenging in trying to identify alienation to help parents, see this from a legal perspective?
I think that one of the trickiest things is that half of people in abusive relationships don't even realize that anything is wrong.
Mm.
Because it's become so normalized. And so Chris and I were just talking the other day about a line that my ex in particular said to me, relationships are hard. And I think we get these ideas in our head of how things are supposed to be. Like, oh, our kid is just being difficult, or this should be expected, or they're adolescents. And so we think, oh, it's not really that bad. And so patterns of behavior that have gone on for a while a couple is still together just get worse post separation. And so for Chris and I with the legal end of it is we always want to try to get things documented in writing as much as possible to start building a case long before you even get to court. And so understanding the different factors, we call them the alienation factors, and this comes from Dr. Amy Baker, and the Baker model is used to build an alienation case. We'll often go through with our clients some of those factors to start looking for, and then, if possible, to start communicating with their ex about, this just happened the other day, and to anchor them in a value that's not just something that the court cares about, but a human value. So, for example, one of the things that the court cares about a lot is that a child has the right to have a relationship with both parents. I mean, I'm not talking about extreme abuse that's been documented. That's different. Unless, something is really, really bad that can be proven, that child and both parents have a right to have a relationship with the child. So the courts want to see that each parent is supporting the child's relationship with the other parent. And the flip side, which we get into, and we'll get into this later with alienation factors, is one parent undermining that child's relationship with the parent? And so that's the stuff we want to start documenting and paying attention to ahead of time. And that's why, Charlie, I think it's so important for you to talk about pre-alienation, because just today, one of our clients was saying how she felt like things really started long before they
mm,
separated.
mm.
And she wished that she could have known what to look for. And
Yeah.
so some of the things you just mentioned, the constant interrupting, I mean, oh my gosh, another flashback, not with my family, my nuclear family, but my extended family. I remember I'll just call her one of the aunts when this boy was from when he was really little, when as every time we would get together for a family meal, his mother would interrupt. Like I would ask him what he was doing, and his mother would interrupt and speak for him. And as he became older, he wouldn't talk. It was like he had no voice. And it kind of reminds me of what you just said about the interrupting is not allowing a child to have a voice.
And I think for people who are sort of just beginning to understand that they might be being alienated today, I think it's so important for them to really look back. And I always look for catalysts because there's normally something that begins this off. Sometimes it's, a partner has decided they've had enough of you and they go off and have a relationship with somebody else. And then, you may find out about it, you may not find out about it, but at that point in time, they've already written off your relationship as a couple, and they will start the alienation. So that's, if you think your partner's had a relationship, then you should be looking at how they're now treating your kids. Are they planning the end of this relationship and starting to align the kids? But there's nearly always a catalyst. With some people, it's very obsessive parents who, are trying to control that child and the relationship with the child almost from birth, and one parent has just been cut out.
Hmm.
But there's normally something that kind of starts this process off. Um, you also find that they're trying to make you out to be the bad person, exactly as you were saying. They want you to be perceived as the person who's responsible for the breakdown in the relationship and for everything going wrong in the family because they don't want to take blame themselves. And I don't normally talk about my personal experience, but I'm just going to throw in a few things. Um, I um, sorry, 'cause one of the things that people don't recognize when they're going through this is they've been psychologically abused. And I think it's really good that you stick your hand up and say, actually, I've been psychologically abused, because then you can do something about it. But the example I was going to use is my ex had an affair with somebody. Um, and she then concocted this story about me having an affair with somebody and even dragged one of my kids off to an SDT clinic to get tested because she'd been sleeping with somebody else. But the story that was told to my kids was, your dad's been sleeping around. He's then been sleeping with me. And there was no intimate relationship between myself and my wife for many years at that point in time. But the story for the kids was there's been he's then had an intimate relationship with me. So I need to go off and get checked for what he's done to me. And but the kids believed it. And one of the big problems with pre-alienation is that these stories start getting embedded into the kids' kind of perception of who we are. And one of the big shifts when you go from pre-alienation to alienation, parents are often surprised by what they perceive as the speed at which children suddenly flip.
Hmm.
Of course, that's not happening at all. It's all the way down to this pre-alienation that has, potentially been going on for years. And all that's happened is the child has got to a point where the pressure that's being put upon them is so great, particularly when you get to split, when you separate as a couple, that the child now has to align with one parent, usually the alienator, or in fact, nearly always the alienator.
Hmm. Yeah, you talked about the loyalty conflicts. And I mean, people like this generally have some kind of personality disorder and they see things in very black and white ways. And so just like they were with they are with the rest of the world with loyalty, it's like you're with me or you're against me. And so the child is put in that same position where they have to choose one parent,
Mm,
and they recognize who they have to choose because they often see what that person has done to you, and they're afraid of also being rejected or cast aside or abused. And so they will align with who they might perceive as more powerful
mm.
in that relationship dynamic.
And I think we should recognize, well, that what's happening to the kids is psychological abuse. There's no this kind of we shouldn't beat around the bush, and this is why really that it should be criminalized. They haven't got to that stage yet. I mean, coercive control is starting to be treated as a criminal activity. Manipulation should be treated as a criminal activity as well. Um, but it's it's so important for people to start looking back into that sort of pre-alienation phase, because if you want to understand a lot about kind of where you're at currently with alienation and what you're trying to deal currently with your kids, you have to look back into the history and say, okay, what have they been led to believe over what sort of time period? What's the subconscious narrative that's now going through their mind? You know, what is their belief system that's been built up over this long period of time?
Yeah, I mean, one of the alienation factors that's used in legal situations is when one parent starts sending poisonous messages about the other parent to
Mm.
the child. And this can be done without saying a word. And so I call it the three U's, like the three ways, the three things that these messages kind of signify. One, that you are unsafe, the
Mhm.
next, that you're unloving, and the third is that you're unavailable. And
Mm.
so think about those three themes. And by the way, the chat is open. If anybody can, if this is resonating with anyone, if it's making you think back to what might have happened years before. I know most of our clients tend to be out of the relationship already.
Mm.
So they have time that's passed since the split. But if this is reminding you of anything and you want to put it in the chat, that would be great. Um, but Charlie, what kinds of people do this? Because Chris and I only deal with high conflict cases. Our cases are full of it. But a
Yeah.
lot of lawyers that I interview don't exclusively deal with high conflict, and they say these cases are few and far between. So what would make someone behave like this?
So, generally speaking, the sorts of people that are alienators, um, they tend to demonstrate cluster B, or in most cases, not in most cases, but in a lot of cases, narcissism. And there's a bit of a debate around, is narcissism nature or nurture? In my view, it's predominantly nurture. And
Mhm,
we see this theme again and again and again, which is that the people who have a propensity to alienate have either been traumatized at some point in time in their own younger years, or they've been spoiled rotten as kids. So
mhm,
they either come into their adult life being very entitled and feeling that, they can do whatever they want, or they've come from a place where they've been traumatized, so they've been kind of psychologically abused themselves. But the characteristics they tend to show are very similar, because but both sets of people actually feel, so one of them feels very entitled, the other feels very insecure. The people
mhm,
who've been traumatized, which is kind of the majority of them, these are really insecure individuals. They demonstrate certain tendencies. So, for instance, they can be quite childlike. This is the inability to compromise, the inability to say sorry. You just don't hear these people apologize. It makes mediation with them virtually impossible, which is why we go into high conflict and you end up in courts. But they're basically traumatized individuals. So their coping mechanism is is essentially to try and control the world around them.
mhm,
This is why they manipulate people. They're also very easily triggered, and there are five big triggers for the alienators, which is very relevant to this. So the first one is, when you actually separate. That's a massive trigger for the alienators, which is why they often increase the alienation, kind of like the mask comes off, the gloves come off. Because although they dislike us, in fact, they hate us, they still had a dependency upon us. They still look just for some degree of emotional support. Now that's being withdrawn, their go-to response, increase the alienation. Second one, anything to do with court, because they can't control and manipulate that situation as they can in other circumstances. And again, their go-to response, increase the alienation. So, when you're going through divorce, it's a lot of court and custody. That's when we saw a lot of the alienation escalate.
We call those inflection points, by the way. Like
Inflection
court
points.
dates, yeah, inflection point. Like we said, be ready for a spike in all this.
Yeah, yeah, because it happens. Money is a big one for these guys because they're not emotional relationships are a lot less important to them than material stuff. They want the house, they want the pension fund, they want the cars. In fact, they want the kids, they want everything. They just want to cut out a little piece of that world, which is us, and extricate us and keep everything else. Uh,
Pause, Charlie, for 1 second. So you're just making me think of all this stuff. But what you just said, I often say the quote, they say, what's mine is mine and what's yours is mine too.
exactly.
Everything.
Yeah, yeah. And because they are very insecure people and very uncompromising, in their heads, they think that they're doing the right thing for the kids. And what I found really interesting about these individuals is that they recognize the hurt that is being put upon us by damaging our relationship with the kids, but they don't seem to recognize the damage that's been done to the kids. And one of the points you made when one of the Amy Baker factors is that a kid naturally wants to have a relationship with a loving, available parent, which is what we are. And it's totally unnatural for a kid not to have that relationship.
Right. And kids want to have relationships with their parents even when they're abusive because it's their
Absolutely.
parents.
Yes. Yeah. So it's really helpful for people to understand kind of the narcissist mindset. So if you think you're in a relationship with somebody who's showing, or even if you're not sure if they're showing narcissistic tendencies or not, go and get some books, read up on this stuff. Um, they're very predictable, these people. And when we're saying who is doing it, it tends to be the narcissists. There'd like two layers to this. Go and look at narcissism, but also go and look at, from what you know of the person, what is it from their past that they've been traumatized by? Was it something to do with their parents? Was it something to do with siblings? Where's this stuff coming from? Because you want to avoid um, poking the bear. Don't trigger these people because whenever you do, so that's why, the court, the separation, the money, you getting into a new relationship, they go nuts when you do that. And also, if you have a good relationship with your kid, in each of these instances, they turn up the alienation.
Yeah, and the thing about not triggering them, so that's a big part of what we do in terms of how to communicate with an ex.
Mm,
Not that you have to walk on eggshells, not at all, but how to try to lessen the conflict because Chris and I work in we were part of a network called the Amicable Divorce Network, which you always say is an oxymoron because we only deal with high conflict cases, but our goal is to meet other people, professionals who can help our clients in our community turn down the volume on the conflict. And so there's a lot of things that you can do, even with a very difficult ex with a mental illness, that how you can shift your own behavior not to trigger them. And like you said, Charlie, they are very, very predictable. We know they care about money, appearances, and they need to feel like they're a wonderful person, often a wonderful parent. So there's a lot of ways you can do that. And so there's one thing, Charlie, you said that I disagree with. You said that mediation can be very hard and you end up in court. So we disagree. We think that mediation is a way to keep as much power as possible and to use what you know about the psychology and the predictability about these people to keep them so they're not performing on a stage and manipulating people who don't know your family and to make choices about you and your kids' lives, but to think, what can I do outside of court to keep communicating, to keep them on simmer rather than it blowing it up into a boiling mode.
So that's a really good point, Lisa. And just building upon that, I mean, what are the sorts of mistakes that you see people make when they're going through divorce when it comes to the kids?
Oh my gosh. All right. So Charlie, I know we're never gonna finish all the questions, but let's get into it. There's lots of mistakes that people make. And I think the first is thinking that your ex has the same values as you do. That and I say this all the time, and it often many lawyers believe that your ex has the same values. And when they think that you're going to come to some kind of agreement, they assume that both of you are going to do what's best for your kids and both of you are going to be fair and reasonable. And that's why these cases are so confounding to most attorneys because they get you there and it's like, I don't understand why your ex just won't agree. I mean, we're being totally reasonable. And so when you use a lawyer who's trained in logic to negotiate for you against a narcissistic ex, you will burn so much money and
Mm.
time and energy because unlike the cadence of what we call normal divorce, where everyone's angry at the beginning, and then once we get the bills pile up, we start settling down and figuring out what to do that's fair and best for the kids and move on with our lives. Our exes want to do the opposite. They want to keep it going for as long as possible. So here we're talking about pre-alienation and how it's so painful for us with the kids. But on the legal end, someone that keeps you in court all the time is taking up your time and your energy and especially your money. And they know you feel really powerless. And we talked about how money is so important to these people. They don't care what the cost is. They don't care that they're spending through your kids' college education or that no one will have any money in the end because their goal is to punish you. So whatever it takes, they'll do that. So
Totally.
yeah,
They hate us, and I
right.
that's something that I try to kind of help parents to understand. They actually hate us. It's not a dislike, and they can become completely obsessive about this for years and years and years.
Oh, we know that. Yeah, that's one of the things in our first book that we talk about in terms of an indication of a high conflict divorce, and that's anger that does not subside.
Mm, mm.
I mean, for those of you that are not our clients or know about Chris and I, Chris's ex was taking pictures of my car like years into our relationship. I had nothing to do with the demise of their marriage, but it was just still this on and on thing. My ex sued Chris and I for $4 million in defamation in civil court when we were 9 years in, you know,
Wow.
8 years after the divorce, because it was like, what else can I do to keep this going?
Mm,
That's the way that they still have to engage with you. They're
mm.
limited. So if they can still get you with the kids, money, court, they will do it.
They'll use it. Something else that I think would be helpful just to throw in as well is um, what is like what are the kids going through? Because if we think about there's three players in alienation. There's the alienator, who we've kind of talked about a little bit, and they're just basically trying to keep themselves safe. I know this sounds crazy, but that's all they're doing. That they if they don't win, they feel really unsafe. If they don't get their way, it undermines their confidence. Um, so their mechanism for giving themselves that safety was all the things you were talking about, how they look, the materiality, winning, being in control. I mean, they're impossible people to work with in a court situation because they're not compromising. But but also it's worth looking at what's going on with the kids and what's going on with us. So the kids also just want to be safe. And when you have a parent who's putting all this like subtle pressure on you, the things that the kids naturally do is they start kind of ad adopting the dialogue, the narrative that's coming from the alienating parent. And it's so subtle during this kind of pre-alienation phase because there isn't open conflict between the parents, or not to the point that it escalates to when you get into a position of divorce. Um, but there's enough of a narrative going along, and the kids they just want to keep themselves safe, especially and when they get into their kind of teen years, kids become even more sensitive because they're trying to find out where their place is in the world. They're worried about how they look. Are they meeting all of the societal norms? I mean, they're under so much pressure anyway. Just being a teenager, the last thing you need is to have warring parents. And the coping mechanisms when we talk about alienation, they're all about keeping themselves safe. And then you look at us. So the people who tend to end up with the alienators, we tend to be empaths, just as a common rule. And the empaths, we've also had a degree of trauma when we were growing up. Sometimes it's really subtle, but it generally involves parents who haven't given us enough love, care, and attention. And so we don't have a great sense of self-worth. We don't have a great sense of self-confidence. And it's really interesting because that's in our personal life. In our career lives, we might have had a much better experience and we'll go toe to toe with anybody. But when it comes to our personal stuff, our personal lives, we're people pleasers. And this is part of the recipe during this kind of pre-alienation phase, because our coping mechanism as an empath is if I keep everybody else happy, then some of that will come back to me and they will keep me safe. But when you're with a narcissist, they're all about give, give, give. Sorry, they're all about take, take, take. It's a bottomless hole of take, take, take. It's never enough, whatever we give them. And we're in the give, give, give space. Plus, we don't like conflict until we're absolutely pushed to a point. But generally, we'll avoid conflict, especially in our personal relationships. So we're defenseless. Our coping mechanism, which is give, 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 just throws fuel onto the fire during that pre-alienation phase because we're constantly compromising ourselves. And
Yeah,
it,
like what can I do better?
yeah, yeah, and it gives the alienator this opportunity to kind of get a much stronger foothold. And the biggest pity about pre-alienation is that, by the time you've gone through it, it's too late. It's done. But it's still really helpful for everybody to look back and understand what are these foundations that have been put in place. How did those come about? What was the role I played in it? What do I need to start doing differently going forwards? How can I start mitigating some of the damage that's been done by the alienator? How can I start understanding what my kids have already been through, let alone what they're currently going through and what they might yet go through in the future? So this is why it's really helpful to kind of compartmentalize all these things.
Yeah, I think that's a great segue just before we go into Q&A because I didn't realize Chris had texted me and said we have a few questions ready when you guys are to start going into Q&A, and I know we're going to try to keep it to an hour. And of course, we didn't start getting even to the beginning of those alienation factors and how to start properly documenting for court, but we can do that next time. And before I forget, because I know I'll forget saying it at the end, if, like I said at the beginning, our content is driven by our clients and our community, and so we love hearing the kinds of things that you feel like you need help with specifically in this area of alienation or legal stuff connected to alienation and whatever with the kids. So if there are things you need help with, Charlie and I are going to be brainstorming ideas for future webinars together, so please put it in the chat. But if it's okay with you, Charlie, Chris said that there's a few questions waiting, and I want to make sure we have a little bit of time
Yeah,
to answer them.
yeah, absolutely. And I would just again building upon what you just said, Lisa. This is kind of a journey that we're going to go on with everybody who wants to listen to these webinars. And follow us along on this because there's so much that we can share and tell you that would just help you to navigate these incredibly difficult and challenging waters. But the sort of information and insights that we have can make such a difference. I mean, really would be transformative for people's lives.
Yeah, and just before we get into it, my favorite button from when I taught high school, it says, if you think education is expensive, try ignorance. You cannot afford to be ignorant about this topic for
Mm.
so many reasons. And we'll get into, like, I see one of the last questions is, what does someone do when you're wrongly accused of alienation? We do a ton of stuff on that with strategic communication. But first, I want to let Chris go in order with the questions.
Yeah, the audience is very good at asking the big questions that like just if I like that last one, if I throw it out there, it'll be like, okay, well, we have like 5 more hours. We can stay on. No, but so the first one I wanted to I'm not going to go exactly in order, but it was talking about how to teach a child. In this case, the question was about an older child, but I would probably apply to different ages, to advocate for themselves, right? With, you're the healthy parent, child is going to the other parent that's a problem. How do we teach our children to advocate for themselves without creating the impression that we are alienating ourselves in our behavior?
Oh, Charlie, you want to take this one first?
Yeah, so this is one of those kind of like catch-22 situations in many ways. Um, the one conversation that a kid generally doesn't want to have is all about being caught in this loyalty conflict and uh, having negative things said about the person who's trying to influence them. So I call it the loyalty conflict because that's exactly what it is. Um, it's a very uncomfortable place for a child to be because they don't want to have to take sides. And I mean, we can try and encourage our children to have better boundaries with the parent that's trying to influence them. But it can be really hard because that child is being put under a lot of pressure by that person. I mean, there's all sorts of stuff that we'll get into when we're talking about alienation, but they're giving them false choices. They're giving them they're parentifying or adultifying them. They're making them feel entitled. There's a whole bunch of stuff that's going on with that kid. They might be being love bombed, but it's conditional love bombing. I'll love bomb you and I'll spend money on you and I'll pay attention to you, providing you do what I want you to do. And as soon as you're not doing what I want you to do, I take all that stuff away. So, I mean, with a question like this, Chris, it's one of the big ones, but actually, it will really depend on the specific situation that you find yourself in with your kid and your alienator as to what is the best way to kind of manage your child. But generally speaking, what they most want from us is kind of love and support and care, and not to be heavy-handed with them, but try to be kind with the kid, be compassionate with the child, try to give them confidence as best you can, because they're in this highly pressurized situation. And that's why they cut us off and they stop answering our texts and all this sort of stuff because they can't cope with the pressure. I think, were you going to add something, Lisa?
Yeah. So there was a psychologist that I interviewed maybe a couple years ago named Dr. Alina Boye, and she works with students who are really young through their early 20s. And
Mm.
she said that that kids in general want two things, which to me sounded like little narcissists. They want control and attention. And
Hmm.
so she talked about something called the 10-minute rule. And she said that if you can spend, because I know a lot of us don't have time every single day with our kids. But when you're with your kids, if you can spend 10 minutes doing something that they lead you on, something that they're interested in,
Mm.
and you can kind of get on their level and be like, can you show me how to do that? Or you're really good at, let's say, baking chocolate chip cookies. Can you show, I'm not really good at, can you show me how to do it? Where you're almost praising them and having them guide and lead you, even if it's a video game, whatever it is, where you're giving them your full attention and they are controlling what you're doing. I mean, obviously within limits. That's something that kids really appreciate, especially kids in situations like these who don't have much agency over their lives, especially with the other parent.
Mm.
And think about how people like your ex are probably incapable on focusing on anything except themselves and what benefits them. So by you doing this on a regular basis, as often as you can, showing them that you care about them as individuals, that's going to start developing patterns where your kids can see the contrast between the parenting styles and that you love them no matter what. You're interested in them as a separate individual because you know people like your ex, it's so enmeshed.
Yeah.
So hopefully that adds a little bit of
I, I, I,
ideas.
I think it does. I think I would just add a little bit further as well, which is for 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 most of us, we just have a natural propensity to be an authoritarian parent, and we have to learn how to be the coach. So
Mm.
we have to. It's kind of exactly the saying. It's not just it's focusing on the kids, letting them do stuff, but also we have to help them to problem solve their own issues, because especially when they're teens and they don't, they think we're all like really ancient dinosaurs and they don't really want to take advice from us. And then they're being alienated on top of that. Um, Helping them to solve their own problems is a real gift that we can give them, something that's really important to do.
Yeah, and me from teaching high school, I remember a big thing is to help them work on critical thinking skills. And I'm thinking this could be an idea for another future webinar because it's so rich.
Mm, definitely.
Yeah. All
All
right,
right.
Chris.
Yeah, thank you guys. So the next one has to do with a forensic psychologist, or it could have been an evaluator, any kind of professional evaluator recognizes that parental alienation is occurring, but still recommends more time for the abusive parent. So, like the question was about how does alienation in a legal sense affect parenting time?
Charlie, you want me to start with this one?
I think this is perfect for Lisa.
Okay. All right. So we'll get into those alienation factors on a separate webinar. But in terms of forensic psychologists, that's someone, if, in case you don't know, who is usually hired to investigate during a custody situation. And Chris and I know that in general, without like real documented abuse, that a lot of places kind of gravitate towards 50-50, and a lot of parents get really worried because they see alienation happening and they're like, why would an evaluator encourage more time with someone that's doing this kind of behavior? So I think a lot of it comes down to what Chris and I call strategic communication and documenting your ex's patterns of behavior over time and how they interfere or undermine your relationship with your child. So, for example, one of the factors that we often talk about is how, everyone should be all children should be allowed to have a relationship with both parents. And the courts look at the level of conflict between those parents. Another thing that courts care about is shielding children from what's happening in court and to not involve them in conflict as much as possible. So when we teach our clients about strategic communication, we like to put something called a universal agreement or an anchor in the midst of the communication. And so for alienation situations, we'll often put a line in the documentation of like, this happened. The other day, our kid came home and said that you said this, but I'm sure we can both agree how important it is to shield our kids from the conflict between us. When you put something like that in writing to your ex, it documents what happens, and it also, we always say, you're speaking for that invisible audience. You're writing to your ex, but you're writing for that invisible audience. So you always want to focus on how you're being the best co-parent possible, and you are encouraging the relationship with the other parent. But when they are doing behaviors that undermine your ability to have a relationship with your child, we have to start documenting them properly to show the pattern of emotional and psychological abuse. And there's ways to do that, but it is like very technical and tricky. And it's also involves thoroughly understanding those alienation factors and how you can align your evidence to fit with each of those factors, and then tying it to the relief that you're requesting from court. And sorry if that was really technical, but it was a
No,
little bit of a technical question.
but it's a brilliant answer, Lisa, and I think there's an elephant in the room here as well, which is a lot of the people who are assigned to do this sort of analysis don't actually understand parental alienation, and
Right.
this is a massive issue for parents because there are even people out there in the reunification space who don't understand parentification, or sorry, parental alienation.
Mhm.
Um, it's something that we're probably not going to be able to address until such time as it's in the DSM-5 or the ICD. But right now, psychologists don't actually recognize it. So all the work that you guys are doing in Being They Got Out is fantastic because it helps go such a long way towards kind of bridging that gap, that knowledge gap that exists out in the industry at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, we really believe in a bottoms-up approach. We know the system's not going to change anytime soon, but there's a lot of ways you can work within the system. And I remember meeting a man named Evan Stark, who's the author of a book called Coercive Control. And he talked about how the way we change the system is by coming in and basically educating judges through our own experiences.
Mm.
And I think when you have proper documentation and you can tell a story that shows your children deserve to have that relationship with both of you and connected to the ways that a child suffers if they're not able to have that relationship. We don't even need to use the term. We don't want to use the term parental alienation.
Yeah.
But again, it's telling that story, connecting the patterns of behavior, and persuading a judge to give you what you need, give your child what they need, and get out of there.
Yeah, and I think what you guys do is incredibly important because so many parents they start off from a position of not understanding this, but they're too reliant on, the lawyers and the legal system to help them to kind of get through this in a fair and reasonable way, which just doesn't happen in so many cases. So all the stuff that you guys do is absolutely priceless.
Well, thank you. And of
Thank
course,
God you're
Charlie.
here.
Thank you. Same. But let's
Yeah,
get to the next question.
thank you, Charlie. And yeah, before we go to the last question, I would just add to that the original question here was about an evaluator who recognized alienation but still gave a recommendation for more time for the alienator.
Hmm.
But there's also then we got into lawyers and making the case in to a judge about alienation. And what I'd just like to add to what you both said is that alienation cases are different, and not a lot of attorneys um, understand the subtleties of them. So definitely have, if your case is going to follow the alienation path as part of your narrative, make sure your attorney consults with an attorney who truly understands alienation.
Yeah.
So
And we
then,
can and we have resources of people like that, but that's for another time.
yep, definitely for another time. So the last one, so the a court. So speaking of reunification, being a goal, right, for a lot of people who have been alienated, they go in front of a judge, they ask for reunification, and they are awarded reunification. Can that backfire? Can reunification therapy backfire on the parent in terms of pushing the child further away?
The
Yeah,
parent who's pushed for alienation, I mean, sorry, for reunification.
The alienated parent pushes for reunification, gets it, and all of a sudden it makes things worse. It increases the distance with the child.
totally, totally. I see this happening all the time. It's and I'd be really interested in your view and as well, Lisa. But if you have somebody doing reunification who doesn't have the right skills, you've got a kid who's turning up at these sessions, and let's assume that the kid is staying with the alienated parent, because that tends to be what's happening. So the kid is coming to these sessions to be reunited with the alienated parent. So the kid gets groomed and pressurized before they turn up at the session. Um, the kid themselves might feel there's, a perception of there's something wrong with me, the fact I have to go to a session in the first place. So I'm gonna meet with a psychologist. Um, the alienator is paranoid that the kid's going to say something that might be bad about the alienator. So the kids are kind of very groomed, very nervous about having this conversation. Uh, they're then put in a room with the person that they're not supposed to be spending time with, and that's really uncomfortable for them. And then the kids start lying in a lot of these instances to protect themselves because they're holding the narrative to protect themselves and the alienating parent. Um, and the alienated parent just becomes the scapegoat in these sessions because the psychologists and other counselors, if they're not trained on it, they don't realize the kids are lying. They're not looking for the signs of alienation. And when the kid says, well, this parent is the bad parent, doesn't make me feel safe, they do all these things that are wrong. The psychologist takes all that stuff at face value and just makes it impossible to reunite with the kid. I'd say it makes it even worse. I would recommend to parents not to go to somebody to help with reunification if they are not suitably qualified, if they don't have the experience to do it. Um, the other element to that as well is that as long as the alienating parent is still in the background, you might make some progress during the session, but then you'll go backwards again once they're back in the company of that parent, because these people do not give up. They're very obsessive. So, yes, reunification does work, but it tends to work best when it's court ordered and that you've got somebody who actually knows what they're doing, and that very often there is a no contact order for the alienated parent, so the alienating parent. So the alienating parent's not allowed to see that child for a period of time to allow the alienated parent and the kid to rebond and reconnect again. So
All right. So I have a little bit of different. I agree with you with parts of it, but ours is in a different direction because we always think, what do we ask the court to do?
mm,
They can deal with time, money, they have limited things that they could do. So, in terms of reunification therapy, in our experience, we've interviewed Bill Eddy, and he was a social worker turned lawyer, matrimonial, divorce lawyer who worked with a lot of high conflict cases, and he started something called the High Conflict Institute. And so, with his background in social work, he wrote a book called. He's written a ton of books. He wrote a book called "Don't Alienate the Kids." And in that book, and in one of our interviews together, he talked about how reunification therapy on its own, like you said, Charlie, the kids with the alienating parent for so much of the time that it's not generally very effective. But what he sees as much more effective is a family systems therapist who is trained in the dynamics of high conflict families. Not that you're the high conflict person, but your ex, high conflict situations. And therapists who are trained in something called DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy, which is often used with personality disordered individuals, tend to be more effective because they already understand the nature of these kinds of relationships. Also, Charlie, you said that when a kid just goes to therapy, then it's like, oh, what did I do wrong? Like, I'm the problem because I won't just go right back and do what other people want me to do when I've already been brainwashed. That a family systems therapist works not just with the kid, but the kid is the client, but the system of the family is who's being treated. So they will work with you as well as your alienating ex and figure out ways to make them feel like there's options and choices so that because otherwise they just fire the person. So using like very delicate methods is important. And then the other thing that I'm thinking about is case management. So it's not just like, oh, there's some kind of reunification therapy ordered, but there's eyes on the case to make sure that each parent is doing what they're supposed to do. Has the family been to therapy? Is the alienating parent doing what the therapist who's been trained in this suggests that they do? What's happening with the alienated parent? Is the parenting plan being followed? So there's a number of things that, like you said, that really need to be monitored, but very strict court ordered relief is required. Like with not just with deadlines, but with consequences, severe consequences if the alienating parent still continues with that behavior. And that's why it's so important to document properly when you're asking a judge for relief, because you can't just say, I want reunification therapy. You need to say, I need reunification therapy with this particular person and et
mhm.
cetera. And I want case management, like understanding all of that is really important. And I see we're almost at time, but before I forget, so Chris and I have a podcast, and we always start on Instagram Live with doing these live interviews, and that's what Charlie and you and I have done a number of times. But we have a meeting with a reunification therapist who is very well regarded that we're going to try to convince to let us interview. And then we also have a meeting. I think we have an interview scheduled for next week or sometime soon with a family systems therapist that I've met. I met her in real life. And so she's going to talk about the importance of family systems therapy. So there's like two interviews coming up on this very topic. And so Chris and I always welcome questions from our community. So if you have specific things, because I know we're out of time now, for either of those people or for Charlie and I or and Chris, like we would love to hear from you. And again, if you could drop down in the chat any ideas you have for subjects for us to talk about in a future webinar, we would love that.
I think your idea of capturing thoughts from people, what is the content they'd like us to cover, we'll absolutely do that. But also, we've got a pretty good idea of a kind of a structure that we can take people through that will cover all of these bases. Because there will be some people won't even know the questions to ask, if that makes sense.
Right. Of course. Yeah. Because they don't even know what's happening.
Yeah, yeah, and we've got a very good sense of that.
All
So
right. So, Charlie, why don't you say how people can find you and then I'll tell them how they can find us.
cool. I'm on Facebook and Instagram. You can find me under Charlie McCready, just my name. You can also find me in empowering parents to overcome parental alienation behaviors. And I've recently launched something called the Parental Alienation Sanctuary, which is a small private members group where we can provide a lot more support and people get that privacy that you don't get in the public groups. And also charliemccready.com and YouTube and LinkedIn. I'm everywhere.
Yep. And we are too. And we're just look up Been There Got Out. Our website's beentheregotout.com. We're on Instagram and all the other social medias. Our home base is Instagram. That's where we generally start with our interviews. We also have a podcast, a YouTube channel. We have a series of courses that we're starting called From Fear to Fierce in Family Court. Our first book came out in 2023, and our next book is being released in January called When Your Ex Turns the Kids Against You. And we're going to be doing a comprehensive course on this topic. And that's why I'm so excited that Charlie agreed to partner up with us to do these webinars. So again, like we thank you guys so much for being here. We're so sorry that you're dealing with this, but there is always hope. And we will hopefully get into some success stories in a later webinar because I know we have a bunch.
Definitely. There's a lot of really good success stories out there. And I think you're so right. Hold on to hope. Whatever is happening to you, most people get through this and they are, in fact, stronger at the end of this process. It feels awful when you're going through it, but most people actually end up being better and not better, but you're stronger and have good lives again.
Yeah.
I
All
think
right. Go ahead, Charlie.
I think we should probably wrap up there at this point in time. But thank you, Lisa, and thank everybody who came and joined us this evening. And we're really looking forward to continuing to have these sessions for some months yet to come.
Yes. All right. Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.